So I mentioned in my anti-library video that that was inspired by a reaction to a list that this self-help stoic guru guy, Ryan Holiday, made of 26 rules for reading for 2026. And I said I was going to react to that too. And I have 5 buckets I put them into: no strong opinion, disagree, qualified weak agree, qualified strong agree, and strong agree. My biggest issue with the list in general, I think, is he reads for a very specific purpose, which is to write his self-help books, which is not how most people are going to be reading. And some of these, I think, can be a little bit adversarial, which is a video I'm going to make in the future, because I think that is part of why people often struggle to read. And so I'm going to go over these categories, rules by category, but chronologically in the category. So the first category with 3 in it is the ones I have no strong opinion about. And these are, so Rule 11, the rule for quitting a book is 100 pages minus your age. And that is about what I do for fiction, but I don't know if I did it in the past, and I don't know if I'm going to do it in the future. It's right for me about right now, but I don't know if it's a good general rule. And then Rule 14, cool book titles usually make for crappy books. And this one, I think there's a better chance if it's a new book and it has a cool title that it can get published despite being not compelling and worthwhile. And I think there are some books that are interesting but are going to be hard to have a title that is super compelling, that are still worth reading. However, I don't think in general this is a good rule. I think there are plenty of books that have compelling titles but are still worth reading. The other way around, I would agree with the rule, but as heuristic as it is, it's maybe a little bit true, but not enough to really go by. And then the last one is Rule 26, find great stuff and suck everything you can out of it. And this one, I don't have a strong enough idea of what he means about that to even judge that. And so then next category is disagree, and this is the largest category with 9, but that's because I broke agree into 3 categories. So Rule 4 is, if you're not reading with a pen, you're not really reading. Rule 5 is, mark your books, fold pages, beat them up. And Rule 9 is, never read without taking extracts. And these 3 rules get to 2 or maybe 3 things I have issue with, which are, first of all, I don't like defacing books, and it's also distracting to me as a reader what other people have written in it. And then these are also about trying to remember specific details from the book, which I think is going to be mostly useful if you're using the book for some kind of research. And so this guy writes self-help books and he's looking for quotes, so that makes sense, but I don't think it's worth doing. I think it's going to ruin your enjoyment unless this is how you naturally read in the first place. And then the next one is ask yourself, what do I plan to do with this information? And the thing is, I've read so many books where I could not have answered that question, and then I realized later, oh, I see what I was getting at. I do think if you're asking yourself, do I feel like I have a reason for doing this beyond curiosity? Is something compelling me? That's a good rule of thumb, but that is so different from what he said, I just can't agree with that one. Next one is, when you find an author you love, read all their books. And so this is something, a lot of authors I love and I've loved for a while, I still haven't read a lot of their books. Just there's so many good authors. The closest I've come is my favorite fiction writer, Jack Vance. I've read all his science fiction, all his fantasy, and most of his mysteries. But even then, I haven't read all his mysteries. So there's just so many good authors out there, you just taking it literally, no. And even if you're meaning read more of them, doesn't necessarily mean do it immediately. And then Rule 19, so if you see a book you want, buy it, don't worry about the price. This is great if this is your career and if you don't have too many books you want, but I am building an anti-library, which he talks about, and even when I had a job with a 6-figure income, I still could not have bought every book I wanted, and I wouldn't have had the space if I had done that. And then there's some that are really expensive. Like there was this book I wanted to read that was out of print, and the only used physical copy I could find was over $1,000. And I eventually found a very badly scanned PDF, and I'm glad I read it. But I would not have made sense to buy that $1,000 used copy just to read that book. And so I think if it's about try to get a book you really are interested in, find how to read it, maybe, yeah. But even then, if it's too expensive and it's too hard, no library has it, most information you can get from books, most ideas you can find in other books if it comes down to that. And then Rule 20 is, don't judge a book by its cover, but also you kind of should. And the thing is, covers basically are publishing trends for genres. And so there are 2 great examples of this, and I might put them up on screen, we'll see. But one of them is the current version on Amazon of Norstrilia by Cordwainer Smith, who is one of the 3 classic science fiction writers who have such unique styles that I really strongly recommend reading them that people haven't heard of. And this novel on Amazon, this cover makes it look like it is like a dark horror story, and it is nothing like that. And it is misleading. And there was a book I read, Space Between the Worlds, where the cover, the old cover, looked like a young adult apocalyptic novel. And after reading it, I looked to see if the author had written any other books, and I found her Twitter where people were complaining that they were expecting a young adult apocalyptic novel, and she was like, I didn't pick the cover, the publisher did, but that is not what this book is. And so, yeah, book covers just tend to reflect publishing trends and not what is in the book, so I would not go by this for the most part. At best, it's going to tell you this is the sort of category of book the publisher thinks it is or wants to sell to readers of it. So I disagree with that one. Then don't be satisfied by just getting the gist of things. And again, this is one that I strongly disagree with, because I think a lot of the time it is really helpful to get the gist of a book. And you can always reread books, which is another item on his list. So if you're trying to get every detail out of a book, it's going to drive you crazy. And I've talked about Martin Buber's I and Thou, and I was the only one who, after the first section, I was reading it like poetry, not trying to get all of it, which is what the translator Walter Kaufman advised. And I was also the only one who was not immensely frustrated, because that is not a book that you can deliberately read to try to get all the details and get it. And it's not a good way to read books. It's adversarial. I don't think it's helpful. And then the last one on my list of 9 things I disagree with is 24. Prefaces and forewords are there for a reason. Don't skip them. And I pretty much always disagree with this. I mostly don't think they add anything, and especially don't add anything before reading. But there is one category of exception where this is true, and that is the translator's note. And so this one has one that's about 4 pages, and most translated books have translator's notes that are 4 pages or less. I've seen them as short as a page, and there was one that I saw that was like 8 pages, but that's unusual. Normally they're 4 pages or less, and the translator is often telling you things that are going to affect how you read the book. So I would say there's a translator's note, and especially if it's before the main material, read the translator's note. But aside from that, I would actually say skip the prefaces and forewords, and then if you like the book, you can go back and read them if you want to. And now we're moving on to qualified weak agree, and I have 4 in this category, which are his rule 2. Speed reading is a scam. You have to spend a lot of time reading in order to get the book. And so that is mostly true, but also, like, I keep talking about self-help books, and I just reread this book yesterday, and this is 230 pages of actual book material, and it took me under an hour to read. And part of it is the pages have like half as many words, but also I'm reading for information, and I read fast for information, and it's still not speed reading, but reading for information, I am reading faster than when I'm reading for pleasure, but I'm still getting the information out of it. And so, yeah, speed reading is a scam if it's like, of course, this is going to teach you how to read faster, but there are ways you can read certain kinds of things faster and get all the information. And I actually have a friend who, she asked me to read an essay, and I was back in under 5 minutes with feedback. She's like, there's no way you read that. And I'm like, yeah, I did. And then she found a reading speed test, and it was either 700 or 900 words a minute. But the thing is, I was 90% comprehension for that test, which the average person is 70% reading much slower. And so, yeah, you can read fast for information and still get stuff, and slowing down is probably not going to help you. Like courses that are selling speed reading, yeah, that is, I would guess most of the time that's going to be a scam. So then don't just read books, reread books. And so this is one that I agree with, but I think you have to read enough that you know what do you keep coming back to that's worth rereading. And so this one is another one that I have been rereading since I talked about it on this channel in my fairy tales video, because I think that the lessons in here are important. I've been rereading a lot more over the past few years. I used to not reread pretty much at all. And so I agree some amount of rereading is useful, but once you've read enough that you know these are the things that stuck with me that I need to go back and try to get more out of. And once you also have a pattern, like I read this one 1.5 years ago, but I've read enough that I'm like, I know this is the kind of book that is worth rereading. And so then in every book you read, try to find the next one, and it's footnotes. And that one's interesting because, again, another book that I just finished today, actually. No, yesterday. Finished this like 1 a.m. this morning, but I talked about Christopher Lasch, and I finally read his most famous book, and he's someone who I respect and find useful, and he has a lot of interesting ideas, references, and I'm going to read some of the people in the footnotes, but not immediately. And not every, even nonfiction writer is like this. This isn't going to work for fiction, obviously, but even with nonfiction, if it's a really compelling nonfiction writer, then yeah, do that. I've talked about Nassim Nicholas Taleb, Anti-Fragile, and I actually have a chain of, I read Taleb said to read Popper said to read Kierkegaard, and then Popper said to read James, and then I didn't really like Kierkegaard. The point is, do it sometimes, but not every time, and not always your next book. And then next one is qualified strong agree, where I have 5 things. And so the first one is rule 3. You should always carry a book, phone, keys, and a book. And I think this is true if you're spending time on your phone, and I'll see people selling ads for like Brilliant. Instead of spending time on your phone or buying an app for it, get a book that has a bunch of short things in it you can read. And there are some books that work for that, and I might make a video on that. This is one that I normally have in my car, but I actually brought out for this video, Idries Shah Reflections, and you will see if you look at it, most of these, they're often they're really short, which is unusual. Most of the stuff that I use for this purpose, like in waiting rooms and stuff, most of the passages are 2 pages or less, and this one is less than a page. So if you have books that work like that, where they're self-contained small sections, then that is a good thing to carry. So I agree with that, but it needs to be a specific kind of book. And if you're trying to read a dense book, whatever you might be reading, that is often going to not work very well, and you're just going to lose track of the book and be frustrated. And so then rule 8, don't be a book snob, read bestsellers. And yep, I absolutely agree with that one. But read bestsellers if there's a compelling reason to. So if someone you really trust recommended it, if it's an older bestseller that stood the test of time, yeah, read that. But don't read a book because it's a bestseller. But don't avoid books that are a bestseller. And I had someone in my comments recently who, no, not my comments, it was I was commenting on someone else's video, and they responded to me, and they're like, well, you mentioned David Graeber, and the people who read David Graeber are cringe. And I'm like, yes, a lot of cringe people read and cite David Graeber. But he's the only name on that list you know because he's popular, right? But I mentioned other people who are relevant. Just because cringe people read David Graeber does not mean he doesn't have anything to add to the conversation, and he does. So yeah, I agree with this one. Rule 10, if a book sucks, stop reading it. And that one I think is dependent. If it is poorly written and you're reading it for information, keep reading it if the information seems useful. I have found useful information from some books that were not well written. But if it's fiction and you're reading it for pleasure, or if it's nonfiction you're reading it for pleasure and it sucks, stop reading it. And if the information seems bad, yeah, stop reading it. And the next one is Rule 12. Good writers and good books are not hard to read. And actually, my most successful video on this channel so far is I've identified 3 different ways that books can get a reputation for being hard to read. And I think with 2 of those, you should absolutely read those books. And those are if the ideas themselves are hard or require a complicated background, or if the writer is dense. But if the writer is being deliberately obtuse, like Michel Foucault, or possibly even if they're just not respecting your time and they're writing in a very unedited style, then yeah, maybe don't. But some books are just going to be hard because either the writer picked being dense or because the ideas themselves are hard, and it's still worth reading books like that. But don't read badly written books. So the 5th one in this category, Rule 22, read books and writers you disagree with. And this is, again, qualified strong agree, because read books and writers you disagree with where you think you're going to actually get what they're saying, which in my experience means either you respect them as a writer, even if they're saying something you strongly disagree with, and as a thinker, or if you find the idea respectable enough that you think you can get it, even if it is surprising. But if you're reading stuff that is basically the opposite of what you believe by someone you don't respect, then that's just going to reinforce you in what you already believe, because you're not going to get what they're saying, you're going to get what you think they are saying. And so I agree with that, but again, only if you either respect the writer or respect the argument that you think they're going to be making. And then strong agree, so I have 5 in this one as well, which is don't just read more books, read the right books. And this one, yeah, don't really have anything to add. And I've gotten a lot less patient with time for books that don't really do much and are just time killers. Then Rule 6, forget the news. The best way to understand what's happening in the world is reading books, usually old books. And again, yeah, and that's something Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks about in Anti-Fragile and the Lindy effect. And I'm going to talk about this at some point. I'm going to probably make a video about, I have thoughts on Ground News, which they sponsor 90% of channels I watch when they have sponsors. And so might be burning some bridges there, but that's one of the issues I have, is that it is news in the first place, and news is noise. It gives the illusion of knowledge, but so I'm someone who actually remembers old news, and most of it isn't useful, but most people don't even remember it. It just makes you feel informed. And then also, it's noise because it's not part of a broader story. So then, ask people you admire for book recommendations. Yeah, absolutely, as long as your taste might be the same. And so one interesting thing is there's this channel, Library of a Viking, and I started watching his channel because he had a thumbnail of him with George R.R. Martin. He's like, asking writers I like to recommend books. And I'm like, okay, George R.R. Martin is going to be recommending Jack Vance. And he did recommend Jack Vance. He did not recommend the Jack Vance book I would recommend to most people. This guy didn't like it about half for reasons that are connected to, he probably doesn't like Jack Vance, and half for reasons that are connected to this particular series, which is why I would not start out recommending it to most people. which is that this is a series. Vance was often trying to write more pulpy books for a mass audience of the time, and this is one of his pulpier series. I actually have that one on my shelf out there, but I didn't grab it beforehand. And then finally, look for wisdom, don't just memorize facts. And this is an absolutely, you look for connections, look for the core point, look for frameworks, new ways of thinking about things. And then 21, build an anti-library, a stack of unread books that humbles you. And again, I already have a video on that, and another one that might be coming out on that as well. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Ryan Holiday's 26 rules for 2026. I'm Magpie, thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.